Martin Woodward on Azure DevOps with GitHub.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
In full disclosure, when I recorded this show, I was coming off of a cold a few days prior, and my voice just didn't quite have the full strength. So I appreciate you bearing with me, but that's the backstory and how terribly I sound. So let's get on with the show. Greetings, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. You can go to www.azuredevops.show to see past episodes and show notes. We've got some great shows. I encourage you to go and look at the lineup. Our guest today is Martin Woodward, a principal group program manager on the Azure DevOps team at Microsoft and also the vice president of the .NET Foundation. Martin, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be on.
Absolutely. And I hear you recently just escaped from the Seattle snowstorms.
Yeah, as we were recording, Snowmageddon hit Seattle. So luckily I managed to get out of Dodge just in time. As we were on the runway, sort of snow was sticking to the windows and all that sort of stuff. And we had to, queue to get de-iced. But yeah, managed to get out of there before it got too bad. So it's good to be home in Northern Ireland here now.
Awesome. Well, you've had a long journey at Microsoft. For those who don't know you, maybe we can give them a quick rundown of your journey, because you've been involved with the DevOps and ALM space and products for quite a while, even before the products even supported Git source control.
Yeah, that was kind of probably my fault. So that's the thing. It's actually a decade when I joined Microsoft. So in 2009, a small company that I was a part of with a guy called Eric Sink, who you know well.
Yeah.
He did a company called Team Prize, which was the cross-platform and Java tooling for Team Foundation Server. So for Team Foundation version control. When we were looking around at TFS, we knew Microsoft were going to be doing, investing heavily in it, and it was going to be the future and going to be successful. We sort of look around and think, well, what would Microsoft never, ever, ever want to get into? And we're like, I know, Java and open source. They'll never want to get into that. So we thought we'd do a business doing that, and the business did fantastically well. So well, in fact, that basically every single deal where they were selling TFS, the Microsoft salespeople were also selling our product for us, which was awesome. As a small 5-man team, it was perfect for us.
Yeah.
And then Microsoft, was started changing as a company and came to the point where they were like, this Java and open source might not be too bad. Maybe we should buy these people. And so they acquired us November 2009. And that was really kind of the start. That was my first sort of exposure into Microsoft's open source practices at the time and how they worked and why they worked that way. And so you quickly set about kind of fixing them really once I got into the company, and started doing a few things to kind of help improve how we approach open source internally inside the company, and sort of change some policies and the way that the things are structured so we could be a bit more open with open source. And then it was pretty soon after I joined, but it wasn't until I think it was TFS 2013, was it, where Git was a standard. So we started working on distributed version control. Realized that Git was, at the time it wasn't obvious that Git was going to win. On Windows, kind of Mercurial was the go-to choice because
the tooling.
Git sucked on Windows, but Mercurial was awesome on Windows. And Mercurial is a more user-friendly tool as well, to be honest. But it was obvious that Git was kind of going to win primarily because of GitHub out in the real world. And what we didn't want was for Microsoft developers to be in this kind of ghetto where they weren't exposed to Git and everybody else was exposed to Git. So, we thought, hey, Git doesn't work very well on Windows. We're Microsoft. We can fix that. So let's go do that instead and have Git as part of Team Foundation Server. bring Git into the company. And then one day the Windows team themselves rang up and said, hey, we want to move the Windows source, over to Git.
Right.
I'm like, okay, this is going to definitely mean that Git doesn't suck on Windows anymore. So we went and sort of made that happen. So yeah, that's been kind of my journey. And then for a couple of years, for a year originally, I went off to go help, because I've been helping with open source around the business. Went to go help the .NET team because they'd been they were at open source rather than they were looking to really get .NET out as a true open source development environment and community. So helped set up the .NET Foundation. That was originally supposed to be like a 1-year secondment, they call it. Just transfer me over for kind of a year and come back again. And then, looked up and it was, I think 18 months had passed. I was like, what's happened here? We've been having loads of fun with Scott Hanselman and Scott Hunter and Jay Schmelz and people like that. And then talking with Brian Harry, we were wanting to do this offer with pipelines to be able to, what's called Azure Pipelines now. We wanted to be able to do builds for open source projects and make it free for open source projects to be able to do builds, because there are some cloud hosted options there, but it was obvious the stuff we had was more powerful and we could support Windows, Mac, and Linux. And with having the resources of Azure behind us, we knew we'd be able to be very generous with open source projects and help them do their builds. So came back to work for Brian and a guy called Jamie Cool to kind of bring builds to open source, and then look at the GitHub acquisition as well. So yeah, so it's been a fun journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you've been an instigator in quite a few different places. CodePlex, and somebody had to open up the original Microsoft GitHub account.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, so I was looking after CodePlex when we shut it down, really. So that's kind of my fault. Again, we can dwell on that, but I think in hindsight, people can kind of see that was the right decision. But at the time, it certainly, I wasn't popular in every circle for having to make that call. But there we go. And then I created the Microsoft GitHub account because we didn't have one. Yeah. There were some accounts around by Microsoft kind of folks, but at the time the rules were open source goes on CodePlex, closed source goes on TFS. And so I wanted to change those rules again to stop Microsoft being in this ghetto, not exposed to everybody else. Wanted to change it so that we could have an official GitHub presence. So went and created it. I figured that as the owner of CodePlex, that the only person that was going to object to this was probably me. So if I went and instigated it, then nobody else could get me. I couldn't get into trouble off anybody else. So went and did that, and it ran off my personal Amex card for quite a while. So it's now
a big
like
expense report, huh?
Yeah, well, it wasn't too bad to begin with because, as I say, it was mostly for our open source. But you have to run projects, when you're getting them ready, and you quite often you need to get the repo set up and things like that. So it needs to run sort of privately for a little time, even though it's going to eventually be public. So, there was a little bit of expense. It wasn't too much. So around that, used to pay for that for a little while, and then GitHub then had the ability to accept purchase orders. That's surprisingly a fairly recent invention on the GitHub side, and so we were able to move them off my corporate Amex onto a PO, which was good because I think nowadays it's like a Uber, like I can't even remember what the subscription type is. It's like it's one of these strange metal names that they have, but it's it's fairly crazy. So yep, so that's that. I still see the odd bill, but it's not too bad anymore.
Right. Now, CodePlex, well, there was the CodePlex Foundation, then they renamed it to the Outercurve Foundation. So how does that tie all back together with the .NET Foundation?
That's an interesting question, actually. So I looked after CodePlex.com, which was the open source hosting system from Microsoft. And there was a thing called a CodePlex Foundation, which was originally sort of spun out from Microsoft as a way to do kind of open source stuff, but at hands off. Because back then, Microsoft couldn't really, couldn't really do a lot of open source really close to the company. It wanted it to be in this kind of separate foundation thing that owned all the stuff. they had some of the early open source projects like ASP.NET. That was open sourced in the CodePlex Foundation for a while.
Yeah.
When the .NET Foundation began, we brought over projects that what was the CodePlex Foundation, and then quickly got renamed to be Outercurve. Because nobody quite understood what the difference between CodePlex.com was and the foundation, so we just renamed the latter thing. I was never part of that foundation. When the .NET Foundation started, I worked with the Outercurve people and moved any projects over from Outercurve that were .NET related that wanted to come over to the .NET Foundation. We had set up an agreement in place so people could do that, and those maintain, or the source code could be transferred over, and it was all legally covered and all that sort of stuff. So ASP.NET moved over. There are some other projects as well now. I'd have to go look, but there were a few sort of smaller projects, but ASP.NET was the main one that moved over.
Well, I remember MVC Contrib was one of the first third-party projects in the Outercurve Foundation.
Right, yeah, and that came over as well, I think, yeah.
So all right, so Outercurve, is that parallel, or is that still going, or did that kind of go by the wayside?
I haven't checked in with them for a long time, since I was on the .NET side. But when I was on the .NET side, they were kind of in the process of wrapping up the Outercurve Foundation. So yeah, I think it's wrapped up now. I'd have to go check, but it kind of served its purpose. It helped what it needed to do, and the projects have all found homes that needed to find homes. So it was all good.
Well, if there's any community leaders out there, one interesting offering from the .NET Foundation is that for any .NET related user groups around that happen to use meetup.com. And of course, that comes with a cost to run an account on meetup.com. Associating with the .NET Foundation will have the .NET Foundation actually pay for the user group's meetup.com account.
Yep.
And so I run the Azure DevOps user group, and we're linked up. And so that's a great service, because like you said, running on your own credit card, that's just one more expense for a user group leader to incur personally.
Yeah, when we were setting up the .NET Foundation, that was, as well as it being a home for .NET, one of the things that we were keen on is, hey, what services can we provide as it's a separate non-profit company, So what services can we provide as a non-profit company that our member projects can benefit from? Meetup Pro was an obvious one, where by joining together, it's expensive to host a Meetup account. It's not cheap, but we could massively make it easier for there to be .NET meetups like they used to be in the old days with Ineta. We could help that happen again just by picking up their meetup subscriptions, And so, go to Microsoft, work with them, get a sponsorship deal. And then obviously by getting all these meetup accounts together under one Meetup Pro account, Meetup give the .NET Foundation a discount as well from, buying them all individually. So yeah, it makes a ton of sense, helps .NET communities happen locally, and helps Meetup, helps Microsoft. So it's all good, because it means that we get a view over what's all happening over all of them. So as well as the Meetup thing, the other thing that the .NET Foundation provide is the ability to use what's called Open Collective to be able to collect money and things for your user group. So again, you don't want to go through the hassle like some user groups have of, forming a company and doing all that sort of thing. How can we help you avoid that? Provide the Meetup Pro, and then provide a way to collect money into your user group that's funds allocated just for your user group. And so you can collect sponsorships and things from local businesses and then spend them, but in a transparent way. So you don't get people of the community going, oh, Jeffrey's just doing this to pay for his amazing dinners or whatever, or, that fantastic car on the driveway or whatever. People can actually go look and see, oh yeah, this is the money that came in and this is the money that goes out. What a lot of people don't realize is a lot of these meetups that happen, the people that are organizing them, they quite often pay out of pocket for a lot of this stuff. People
Right.
kind of assume there's magic sponsors that descend from the air and you get loads of money or you get paid to do this. And not at all. A lot of times people are, even just silly things like the labels that go on, for people's badges, or, the bits of the signage to go wherever maybe you've got the venue for free, but you need signs that are up there that tell people where to go into the room. And, meetup leaders are paying for all these all the time. And again, it was a way of just, creating an account for them to be able to get this and then be able to handle expenses and
Right.
hopefully one day be able to scale up to travel grants and all those sorts of things. But that's way off in the future. So this is John set up this. John Galloway runs the .NET Foundation now. He's doing a fantastic job, and he's
great guy.
Oh, he's just lovely. He's just such a lovely person. But he's sort of set it up so membership of the .NET Foundation is open now, and you can sort of you can also, there's also corporate sponsors and things of the .NET Foundation, and eventually if we get to the point where there's more, much more than just Microsoft sponsoring, but lots of companies in the ecosystem sponsoring, then we can make sure that money gets pushed into local user groups and all those sorts of things, which is where you come from, where I came from, and definitely where John and everybody else comes from. So it's great to be able to give back to those communities.
Yeah, and I think that if your company, if your listeners, if your company can commit to sponsoring roughly $1,000 a month, then that's the appropriate sponsorship level for the foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's good. If you're a big consultancy and things, if you're doing .NET consultancy, then it actually might make quite a lot of sense. It certainly helps raise your profile of your business. Yeah,
you made a good point about the user groups are costing money, and any type of event where you get people together, regardless if it's a user group presentation or just getting people together in any form or fashion, it costs money. And sometimes they're sponsors, but a lot of times it doesn't cover all the costs. Yeah. And maybe $250 for pizza and sodas, and that's a cost if maybe the venue is free. But I have a party with Palermo where we just kind of get together and socialize, and that costs money. Sometimes I have sponsors, but it's never enough. And so every little thing helps. So, but a lot of times recruiting companies, if anybody has connections, recruiting companies love to sponsor user groups because they get access to a pool of talent and things like that. So
definitely, and by having that account by which you can actually get money in, then it can pay for small incidentals. Whereas sometimes if you don't have that, then what you end up doing is having a company like a recruitment or somebody sort of sponsoring kind, either by paying for the venue or they'll buy the pizza and expense it on their account. But all that can kind of get complicated. It's much easier if you can just have, a single pot of money that everything goes into, and then a single pot of money to pull from.
Right. So Martin, there's a big elephant in the room.
Okay.
And
I've never been called that before, Jeffrey.
Microsoft acquired GitHub.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Microsoft's product supports Git repositories natively. So now the big question, which one do we use? And then, if GitHub is new to Microsoft, is Azure Repos going to die?
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's go straight there, straight for the elephant. So first of all, GitHub came in. The acquisitions happened now. So they're a sort of independent subsidiary of Microsoft. And they are independent. They are an proper independent subsidiary. A guy called Nat Friedman, who comes from the Xamarin days and all that sort of thing. He's their CEO. Can't think of a better person to be their CEO. I was listening to him talk to the GitHub people last week, and he was sort of saying that he was genetically engineered to do that job, and it was completely right. He's like an amazing CEO for GitHub. So very thrilled that they've got Nat in as the leader now. But they're independent, and it's important to Microsoft that they spent $7.5 billion on buying this thing. They don't want the community to evaporate. They don't want to lose the goodness that they got from GitHub. You don't spend that much money on a company like GitHub to then turn it into Microsoft or to Microsoftify it. When you spend that much money on something, it's because you want their culture to infect you, not the other way around. And so it's kind of important that we allow them to be independent, and we allow them to be completely open, and allow them to be a good home for if you're an AWS developer or a GCP developer or whatever, any kind of developer. However, we do need to we want to make sure we can connect developers on GitHub, we want to make sure we can connect them to Azure. We can't do that in GitHub natively because then that would break the openness. But we can do that through Azure DevOps. So we have Azure DevOps Suite of products, which is Azure Boards, Azure Repos, Azure Pipelines, Azure Test Plans, and Azure Artifacts are the main key services within the Azure DevOps sort of suite. So of those, Azure Pipelines serves an obvious function in terms of being able to get code to cloud. So being able to take code from GitHub or from Azure Repos or from Bitbucket or wherever and get it into the cloud. Now, Azure Pipelines called Azure. So lots of people assume it can just send stuff to Azure. It can actually send stuff to AWS, GCP. The AWS extensions are written by Amazon themselves. So, it's very, very good integrations between any cloud. But it also, the thing that Azure Pipelines does is it's a great hybrid solution as well. So if you want to deploy to on-prem from the cloud, or if you want to take from on-prem and deploy to the cloud, or deploy on-prem, then it can do all combinations of those. It can even deploy to both the cloud and on-prem at the same time. So sometimes people will have like a development environment that's in the cloud, but production might still be on-prem. So that's all that in place. That makes a ton of sense. Well, you're right. A lot of people do go, well, what about Azure Repos? Because that's the one that has the most overlap.
I'll pile onto the Azure Pipelines being the simple, powerful solution. Going back 13 plus years, I've installed cruisecontrol.net, Jenkins, TeamCity, and now the Azure DevOps Server. I think it's just about to come out, but the previews are coming out, and where you can download them. And I've downloaded and installed it, and it is a super simple install. So even if people aren't ready to go to the cloud, but they just want the power of the build server, it is a super simple install. And a lot of people use TeamCity as well. Just next, finish. It connects to your local SQL server, and they can run it themselves.
Yeah, no, it's pretty crazy. And the hosted one's even easier because you don't need to install any of that. You just get Mac, Windows, and Linux build servers in the cloud. And it's like, wow, and for an open source project, it's free as well. It's like unlimited build minutes, 10 build jobs in parallel, for these open source projects, or more if you need.
Right. So, but if someone remembers the pain of 2000 and late 2000s, and if someone installed TFS at the point where they had to have their own domain controller and all this other stuff and SharePoint. It had to be your
own domain controller, but it couldn't be installed on a domain controller because then that would be a horrific mess that would ensue. So yeah,
right. Yep. Just that's such history. Now it's a next finish type of experience.
No, it's definitely got really good.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So, Azure Repos, let's go back to that elephant. So, the way I like to describe it, let's see if this makes sense. So, Azure Repos ain't going away, is probably the first thing I should say. But so the way I like to describe it is Azure's the cloud with tools for DevOps teams built in. That's one of the important differentiators of Azure, and something that's unique to Microsoft because we've got this huge history of building development tools. We know how to do that really, really well, and we're good at them. So Azure's the cloud of these tools for DevOps teams just built straight into the cloud. And for, not a lot of money at all, it's like $6 a user, you get a whole suite of tools for your DevOps team. So you get Azure Boards for doing issue tracking and agile planning. You get Azure Repos for doing source control, both TFVC, so centralized version control, and Git. And then Azure Pipelines, as we say, for builds and releases. Don't forget the release part, which nobody else really has. And Azure Test Plans for doing manual test case management, and then Azure Artifacts for doing, NPM and new Git repositories and things like that. So that makes sense. Comes with a base set of functionality built in, but then GitHub's available as a premium add-on for that social coding experience. So if you want to do, a lot of companies are nowadays interested in doing inner source. So taking like open source style workflows and bringing them into the company, bringing some of those tools and sharing that you know from GitHub into the enterprise, then you can do that by purchasing a GitHub as an added extra, GitHub Enterprise, as an added extra. But Azure Repos is going to be there to provide the base set of functionality regardless. And we're critically dependent on it in Microsoft. We're critically dependent on both Azure Repos and GitHub to build our software. There are certain places where today GitHub doesn't have any solution for you. So, for example, if you want a European hosted data center, or if you want to have this like really tight AD integration and things like that, then Azure Repos right now is your only option. But even when that's not the case, I'm sure, again, GitHub's roadmap is completely up to the people at GitHub on how they address. But I'm sure they're looking at, those sorts of things and thinking, right, okay, well, how do we address our enterprise market? And they can go and focus on those. Even when they do that, the two things will make sense because you need a base set of functionality. But if you want that premium social coding experience, then that's when you pay extra for GitHub. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Now, the listeners are probably wondering, because all the listeners of this podcast are people that are using Microsoft technologies to ship software.
Yep.
And so they're thinking, okay, I get all that now. 10 years from now, there's got to be some strategic direction that'll move kind of slow, but 10 years from now, one will end up being the premier source control hosting location, and one will be the, hey, it's still available option.
Yeah. Well, the premier option is GitHub, and so Azure Repos will be around, and Git and TFVC and Git options will still be there. But don't get me wrong, the premier option is GitHub. But it might not be suitable for you right now. So right now it's a choice, you choose which one you want to go for. But it's an easy move between repos to GitHub if you want to, or vice versa if you decide it's not the choice.
The nature of Git.
Exactly. It's just the way it is. But what I find is if I explain it to people that, hey, you have the choice, then all of a sudden, like, alarm bells go off, especially the Microsoft customer, because they're not used to choices. And then, and alarm bells go off, and everyone's afraid of being silver-lit is my expression.
Right, right.
So the first thing is don't worry. You can't get silver-lit on this one because, it's so easy to move around. And also, no, it's not only just easy to move around between Azure Repos and GitHub. We also know it's just as easy to move to, say, Bitbucket or whatever, So it's in our interest not to annoy you, you know what I mean? So it's super easy. But we do honestly think that you need a base set of everybody needs a base set of functionality. And it's suitable for enterprises, and that has enterprise sort of scale requirements in mind, and that's Azure Repos. GitHub focused on the developer. Like, let's make the best experience for developers that we can possibly make. And they're loved for it. It's just awesome. As an engineer, you just want to use the tool because you know it, you understand it, it works really well. And you can do the inner source. You can do a brand, you can fork somebody's code, you can then make a change and then do a pull request from your org over into their org, and all those sorts of different functions that GitHub provide. It's just awesome. If you're a non-Microsoft developer and your company is offering you, hey, do you want, here's a set of tools you can have, and it's Azure Repos, Azure Pipelines and things. No matter how awesome Azure Repos is, and you've used it, it's really, really capable. If they offer you Azure Repos or GitHub, you're probably going to bite their arm off at GitHub because you know how to use it already. You've heard of it, all those sorts of things. So I see what happening is companies sort of having both for a while, and I see them sort of buying in GitHub and sort of allowing teams to start using it. And then I think the proof of the pudding will be how well companies succeed in doing some of these social coding things inside the firewall, how well companies succeed within a source. If you're going to stay in sort of silos and just do development how you do it today, then Azure Repos is probably going to be fine for you, for forever, really. It's going to, it's got awesome pull request functionality. It scales to repos the size of the Windows repo. You know what I mean? It's just amazing. Yeah. But if you're going to start doing some of this thing where I'm going to maybe allow everybody in my company to have read access to all of the code, in my company. But if you want to make a change to this framework library that's maintained by, the team over in New York, and you're over in Denver or whatever, then you can fork it, suggest a change, submit it as a pull request back to that team, and that team can decide if they want to accept that as a pull request or not. If that's how your company ends up starting to work, then GitHub starts to become a more attractive option for you. And so you pay, whatever it is, $20-$30 extra a user to get the GitHub experience. So if you're trying to hire people into the company, and you tell them, oh yeah, we just use GitHub, then they're probably going to go, oh yeah, okay, I know how to use that. All right, move on. So.
Well, that's a really common interview research tactic. When a developer interviews or applies for a job, one of the things that the recruiter and definitely the development manager are going to look at, they're going to look at, okay, do they have a public GitHub account? And let me look at the projects there. Or is there anything, there's not just GitHub, but there's other venues that people can essentially have street cred, public street cred, and having a GitHub account is one of those things. It's a kind of an alarm if you don't have one and have never forked another repository, don't have any public code. Yeah. So I think developers are used to that.
It is. Oh, I thought you were going to go the other way around there, actually, Jeffrey. In terms of my old boss, a guy called Eric Sink, he's friends with a guy called Joel Spolsky, and he kind of has this thing where it's interview questions you want to ask when you're deciding on your employer, not the other way around. And one of those
that too. That's right.
Engineering teams and engineering practices, and if you come into a company that's like, oh yeah, we use
Visual Source Safe.
Yeah, well, yeah. or ClearCase or something like that, then you're like, but if, we use Git, then you're okay. This is interesting. And we're doing continuous deployment. We're doing continuous delivery to our production environments. In day one, you'll be expected to have code running in production in the customer's hands. That's the kind of company I want to work for, not the company that's going to take 12 months to get something to ship, and it might get cancelled at any point in that time. So, as more and more companies are looking to attract sort of, engineering talent into their businesses and wanting to be more engineering focused companies, and that's everywhere from insurance, banking, manufacturing, retail, as well as software. People are competing for this engineering talent, and so they want to provide the best tools for their engineers to be successful. So,
isn't that exciting? There was, there's 10 years ago, there's a lot of talk about the craftsman movement. Mm-hmm. But the picture of a craftsman is this individual person in their workshop, and they're just individually doing really good work. And where now the focus is on coding and programming as an engineering discipline, where it's more like a well-run factory floor than a single individual's wood shop. And I think that's a great analogy where we're, as a field, as an industry, we're adopting more engineering practices where kind of, think of it as mathematically style. We can prove that we're always shipping stable, releasable code instead of relying on one person to just do a good job.
Yeah, be the hero. But the important part there, though, is that we're not going too far on the traditional engineering side, because we recognize that we're usually on the front line of some sort of technology, and the requirements that we're working with are usually a bit squishy. They're usually not very well known.
Yeah.
And this is why DevOps works, because you're just accepting the fact that you're trying to get as close to the edge of chaos, as Ken Schraber calls it, as close to the edge of chaos as possible, because your requirements are not very well known when you start, no matter how well known you think they are, and their technology is usually bleeding edge. Because if it was known requirements and known technology, then why the hell are you building it? You should just be going out and buying it from a company like Microsoft or Amazon or somebody like that. So it's going to be cutting edge technology and it's going to be shaky requirements. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been asked to go solve this problem in the first place.
Right.
And so you need to adopt processes and technologies that allow you to live on the edge of chaos. And DevOps does that, because what you're doing, you're breaking the problem down into small increments. You're delivering a little bit and seeing if you made it better or worse. It's just this incremental delivery, this focus on continual improvement. These are all the sorts of practices you need to adopt when you are living on the edge of chaos. So yeah, anyway, that's that.
Sam Guckenheimer was a previous guest on the show, and he said that DevOps allows us to run more experiments than the next guy, and that just the numbers, the research that he's in the last State of DevOps report, that roughly 33% of the ideas that you have for a change are going to be a good idea, and then 33% are going to have no effect whatsoever when you actually get it out to the market, and then 33% will end up being a bad idea, and you need to hurry up and roll those back. But DevOps allows you to have a shorter cycle time so that you can figure out the 33% of the ideas that were actually good, so you can keep them and then undo the others. Yeah,
exactly. If you have a 2-year cycle time, then then only 1 year in 6 you're going to have a good year. Whereas if you ship every day, then it's one day a week. Is a good day. So yeah, that's definitely what it's about. And we see like the companies that are iterating the most often, the ones that are succeeding regardless of what they're as long as they also listen quickly. That's our definition of done. I know we're going off tangent here, but anyway, it's interesting. Our definition of done inside of Microsoft is that the code isn't just potentially shippable. That's what it used to be when we meant agile. And it's not just it's running in production. Again, that's what it used to be. It's that it's running in production, collecting telemetry that tells you if the hypothesis behind that the functionality was true or false. Have I proven or disproven my hypothesis as to I think this makes the system better? And so so it's not good enough just to have it running in production. You have to be running in production and be getting telemetry back to be able to say the feature's done. Because otherwise, if you're able to ship 1,000 times a day or whatever, Microsoft ships 86,000 times a day right now. Like, it's just crazy, across the whole of the business. Using Azure Pipelines is 86,000 deployments a day. But it's no good shipping that quickly if you aren't also able to learn equally quickly, because otherwise you just end up shipping quicker in the wrong direction. You're heading off in the wrong direction really, really quickly. So you need to be able to learn as you go and then be able to course correct. So yeah, there we go.
So GitHub has a few other features. So you can run a build process in GitHub with GitHub Actions, and then there's also a project system where you can track your own work and have a project board in GitHub. So what guidance would you give there for people on how to use Azure DevOps Services with GitHub together, and which ones of those pieces to use?
So there is actually, we just shipped some integrations with Azure boards and GitHub Git issues and GitHub pull requests and things. So that's just available as we're recording. So it's like this linking with AB pound 123 syntax kind of thing. And that allows you to kind of have now the mix and match GitHub issues with Azure boards. We sometimes find, so within different teams, if you've got a public project, then you need GitHub issues switched on, because people use GitHub issues as a way of interacting with you, But quite often, especially with larger teams, issues is a great list of issues, but it isn't a great work planning system. It isn't a great way of deciding like what your burn down is, how many people do this, blah, 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 blah. And that's where kind of Azure Boards excels, as being able to plan the work of your team. So for those kind of teams, I would recommend that issues is your interface point with your stakeholders, but then boards is where your team plans the work that you're going to do. So that's one area. And it depends on the size of your team if you even need boards for that team. Don't get me wrong. There's these shades of gray. I think in GitHub Actions and Pipelines is another really, really interesting one, because Actions are awesome. They're really cool. They're in preview right now. They're a little bit hard to use at the minute, but I love them. They're if you've ever done like sort of native Git, then it's the equivalent of a post receive hook in native Git land. It's as close as you can do that. sort of and be safe in a hosted environment. So it's automation for your repo. There you go. That's a better way of describing it. If this, then that, or Zapier or something like that for your Git repo.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, one of the things you can do with automation is you can trigger a build if you want to, and that's what most people do with automation is think of builds. But if you'll know, you will have used TeamCity or Jenkins or even Azure Pipelines to do some automation with your repo that probably wasn't a build. You were probably kind of just misusing the tool because the only hammer you had was the CI hammer.
Yeah, like shutting down a VM at night.
Really, with the build system? Did you seriously do that?
Well, I mean, before Azure had the schedule for VMs, you just had to have your own scheduled task somewhere. And we thought, well,
might as well do it in the build server.
Let's just put the build server can trigger on a schedule. So let's have it run that PowerShell slug.
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? And there's all sorts of things like that people will do automation. If you want something to happen when you create an issue, or if you want something to happen when you create a pull request, or if somebody stars your project, you want magic to happen. All these sorts of things. The only way of doing them in the past was with CI systems. Now with GitHub Actions, you have this huge set of tools to be able to do automation. So it's awesome. It's in preview. It's very low level, and it's kind of like automation tasks things you want to do on my repo.
But those are hooks on things that happen in your GitHub project.
That's exactly what it is, and it's only in your project. But also, it's hooks. So and web hooks. In fact, GitHub Actions is a very, very, very sort of thin abstraction over GitHub webhooks, plus running in a container and being able to execute some logic. So at its most basic fundamental, a GitHub action is a bit of shell script that's being executed inside a Docker container that gets past an environment variable telling it where the payload of the webhook is stored. And that's stored in the file within that container. And then so as your shell script, you load up, you parse the JSON, and it literally is a file containing the JSON that would be in the webhook. You parse it and go do something. One of the things you could go do is a build. Now if your build is like, let's think of like a static website. What is a build for a static website? Really,
it's a file copy.
Yeah, AZ copy out to an Azure Blob Store. So maybe all you need to do is just AZ copy out to Azure Blob Store. That's okay. Or what if it's even a node thing, like packaging into a container? Like, is that really a build? Am I doing any validation? The interesting sort of thing, the sort of shades of gray, if you look at what a CI system does, and we'll take Azure Pipelines as an example, but this is the same for TeamCity or for Jenkins or whatever. What a build system does is it does the full builds, and it's set up to support like long running processes. So for instance, an action, you have a maximum of 1 hour and you have a maximum of 1 CPU. That's what an action gets, because it's meant for short running processes. You know what I mean? Builds can last for hours. It can run across multiple CPUs and fork out and have multiple things, but you get all the time real time feedback. You get to see that log as it's happening, whereas in actions you get to see it after it's happened. So you get to see the log as it's happening. And then when the builds ran, you get to see the pass fail or not, which you can do with actions. But you also get to see the test results. So what percentage of my tests passed and failed? What was my code coverage? All these sorts of things. So that's what a big boy sort of CI/CD system's all about. It's those kind of long running build processes. But there's this shade of gray in the middle where, just like you could use a cron job, to do things, or just like you could use any form of automation to do something, it's when do you make the switch between running in an action and running in, say, Azure Pipelines. And that's the interesting shade of gray. With like a static website, I think it's if you want to do any validation. So I have a directory of shell scripts, for example, and I'm I actually have an Azure pipeline run on my directory of shell scripts because I want to run a thing called shell check, which is it checks the consistency of your shell
static code analysis.
It basically does static code analysis on your shell scripts. I want to run that on every single merge because I might have, it works on my machine, but I might well have done something in my shell scripts which is not going to work on some people's machines. So I run a validation for that. Once you start going into the validations phases, then that's definitely where you want to be using a build system of some sort. And obviously Azure Pipelines is the best. And then if you're going into releases, then definitely is when you want to be using Azure Pipelines to be able to track your releases and why, and have release approval gates and all those sorts of things. So yeah, it's an interesting stage to go. What we do have is, if you go to github.com, you can put this in the show notes, but it's github.com whack Azure whack GitHub Actions, and I'll send you a link. That they are the Azure Actions for GitHub, or GitHub Actions for Azure, I think is the official word. And so if you want to call AZ, the Azure command line, and go do a file copy or go build a container and do all that, so you can do that from within action. But if you want to trigger Azure Pipelines from a GitHub action, you can do that as well. Or if you want to trigger Azure boards, and one of the examples I've got set up is a simple repo where when somebody creates an issue and they sort of tag it as a feature enhancement, then it appears over in Azure boards as an issue.
Oh, nice.
You know what I mean? So yeah, have that kind of capabilities there. And it's like, oh yeah, this makes sense now. I understand what actions are for. Actions are for repo automation. Build, Azure Pipelines is for doing builds and releases. There is this shade of gray where I may need to go up to a build tool, and that's usually at the point where maybe I want to validate, or maybe I want to do something that's going to take, be long running or require multiple CPUs or something like that.
So the actions, just to understand the runtime container, I'm assuming it's a Linux container being GitHub.
Yep. Okay.
So what runtime SDKs are available to the script or the commands that can be run? Is .NET Core 2 available in that
if
container?
You pull down the .NET Core 2 Docker container, so you tell it which Docker image you want to be based off, and then you pull down whatever. So you can start off, with a really, really basic sort of, Linux image if you want, or you can go for the .NET one, or you can go for the Azure one that is like what's the equivalent to what Azure Cloud Shell is, and run that sort of thing with all the AZ commands and all that sort of stuff. So it's whatever.
So you can do Bash Shell or PowerShell, or there's a container where you can even write a little .NET Core program.
Yeah, and we have actually in the Azure tasks there is the .NET. There's a .NET, execute task there as well and all that sort of thing. So probably just go use the Azure Actions if you want to go do some .NET. So that's probably the easiest and quickest way.
Nice. Well, hey, Martin, before we go, is there anything else that our listeners should follow up on?
No, I think if you want to go to azure.com whack DevOps or azure.com whack Pipelines and go learn all about, Azure DevOps and what Azure Pipelines can do for you, then definitely go try out those. And if you're running or maintaining any open source projects, then I'd encourage you to go look at Azure Pipelines as a way of building and deploying your GitHub projects. It's just awesome.
Oh, fantastic. Well, hey, thanks so much, Martin, for visiting me. This has been a great show.
Thank you for having me.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.